All right, today we're going to learn about monetary policy. There are two types of monetary policy: expansionary and contractionary policy. The difference is that expansionary, as you can see, it combats recessions, and contractionary combats inflation. The way that expansionary combats recessions is that they increase government spending and they lower taxes. And the way that contractionary policy combats inflation is that they decrease spending, they increase taxes. The reason why is that whenever there's inflation, that means that there's too much money to go around. So they need to get rid of some of the money. So they decrease their spending because spending actually creates money, and they increase the taxes so that the government can take away the money. And in expansionary, it's completely the opposite. They need to make more money, so they spend more money, and they take away and destroy less money, which is what taxes are. All right, now it's time to learn about the reserve requirement, or the RR. All right, so the RR is directly controlled by the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. It's the amount that the Fed requires all banks to keep in vaults from cash deposits, or better known as demand deposits. The RR ratio is actually just a percentage of that the Fed requires all banks to keep. So typically, the reserve requirement in the United States is just 10%. And the ratio would actually look like 0.10. All right, next we'll be talking about checkable deposits, or better known as demand deposits. Checkable deposits or demand deposits are any deposits made into a bank before they're used for loans and taken out by the RR. The remainder left after multiplying by the reserve ratio and subtracting that amount from the DD is known as the excess reserves. Here's an example of it right here. We have ER equals DD minus DD times RR. And the ER plus the RR, they always equal the DD. There we go. All right, next up is money supply. First thing you need to know about money supply is how to calculate the money multiplier, or the MM. In order to calculate the money multiplier, you need to divide 1 by the reserve requirement ratio. Then you will get your money multiplier. Then in order to find out the money supply, you have to use your ER, or your excess reserves, multiplied by the money multiplier, and you will get your money supply. They're used by banking systems, and the money is created after a deposit has been made and processed. All right, now let's move on to some example equations. So say that the Fed bought $10,000 in bonds from Yellow Consulting Firm, who then deposits the money into a checking account at Wachovia Bank. Now, let's just say that that the reserve requirement that the Fed has is 100%. So what would happen to the money supply if the reserve requirement was 100%? All right, so what would happen if the reserve requirement ratio was 100%? Would be that the ratio 100% would be equal to 1. And the money multiplier, which is 1 divided by the reserve requirement ratio. Since the reserve requirement ratio is 1, then so would be the money multiplier. So then what you would do, you would take $10,000 times 1, and you would get your reserve requirement, which is $10,000. That means that your ER would be 0. So your reserve requirement ratio would be $10,000. And your total change in money supply would also be 10,000. All right, next, let's get into a more realistic problem. All right, so there's 2 parts to this problem. If the question asks if the reserve requirement ratio is reduced to 10%, calculate the following. The first part of the question is asks what would be the max amount this bank could lend from this deposit. You take your reserve requirement ratio, which is 10% now, and you multiply that by 10,000 right here, and you would get $1,000. So then if you take the original demand deposit, which is $10,000, and you subtract $1,000 from it, you would get $9,000, and that's your ER, or the maximum loan that the bank could give out. So this would be your answer for that. All right, the second part to this problem asks what would be the max increase in the total money supply if the Federal Reserve purchase bonds. So the reserve requirement ratio is 10% still, or 0.1. The money multiplier would be 1 divided by 0.1, and that would be equal to 10%. And remember, your money multiplier is 1 divided by your RR. All right, so now that we have our money multiplier and we have our demand deposit still, our excess reserves, we now do, in order to find the max money supply change, you do $10,000 times your money multiplier, which is 10, and you would get $100,000. That'll be your answer for the maximum increase in the money supply. All right, the next question asks, if banks keep some of the deposit as excess reserves, or ER, how will this influence the change in the total money supply that was determined in Part B2? Now remember, in Part B2, our total money supply is $100,000. All right, so the answer to this is actually pretty simple. If the bank maintains the excess reserves, the money supply couldn't increase by the full multiplied amount, which is $100,000. And banks would not be able to lend out that full amount. So that'd be your answer. All right, the last question asks, if the public decides to hold money in the form of currency besides as demand deposits, how will this influence the change in the money supply from B2? Remember, in B2 is $100,000. All right, the demand deposit would be less than $100,000, because if the public keeps some of the money as a currency, paper money, instead of putting it into the bank, then the bank doesn't actually have that money. So they can't loan out the maximum amount that they would have normally been able to. And that's it. Thank you for joining me.